Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar to discuss the top compliance trends for 2022. My name is Kayla Wilson, Account Executive at Anecdotes, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. 2021 has been a huge year for compliance. This year made it clear that the market is beginning to recognize the important role compliance plays in every aspect of the business and how crucial it is for a company's growth. We saw this in many ways, not the least of which is through the amount of money raised by companies in the space. With 2021 being such an important year for compliance, understanding where compliance is heading in 2022 and how it will affect businesses becomes even more important. This is why we have brought together an incredible panel of experts to discuss just that. But before I introduce our amazing panelists, I want to remind you all that the Q&A is open. So please feel free to share your questions and we will do our best to get our panelists to answer them a little later on. Okay, so first up, we are joined by Prabhath Karanth, Director of Security, Compliance, and Assurance at TripActions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Prabhath.
Thanks, Kayla.
Perfect. We are also glad to be joined by Terry O'Daniel, Director of Risk and Compliance at Instacart. Thank you for being with us today, Terry.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Perfect. And last but definitely not least, Yair Kuznitsov, CEO and co-founder of Anecdotes. Great to have you with us, Yair.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. We asked our panelists to pick their #1 compliance trend for 2022, and let me tell you, it was not easy to choose just one. So before we get to our discussion, I want to ask each of you to present the trend you chose. Terry, would you like to kick us off and tell us a little bit about integrated risk management?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kayla. I think one of the most interesting trends I've seen over the past few years is the fusion of governance, risk, and compliance with cybersecurity, and the idea that cybersecurity needs to have a very clear view of what the risks a business faces are and find a way to measure them. And one of the trends I've seen that excites me the most is the move towards risk quantification. I think many of us in the risk community have struggled for years with finding a way to build risk models that make sense to the business stakeholders that we speak with, we gather information from, et cetera. And the promise we've always made is that if you give us good data, if you sit in our interviews and answer all our questions, then we'll be able to help you run the business more effectively. And to be frank, I don't think over the past 15 years or so, compliance has really delivered on that. But I think the combination of more tools that are data-driven, that can pull risk-related data directly from source systems, the ability to use better models, such as quantitative risk modeling and statistical modeling, to apply rigor to that data, and then the ability to take that data and have a seat at the table in the conversation between compliance and cybersecurity gives us an opportunity to really take advantage of the fact that cybersecurity now has a seat at the board and now is such an important topic. We need to get better and more disciplined about how we help the business make decisions about where to invest. So I think the sort of fusion of those few trends leads us to a space where we can finally, if we invest appropriately, make good business decisions that have the same rigor that the rest of the business applies. If I have $2 million of exposure, is it worth spending $3 million on a solution? Well, that doesn't make sense, but if I wouldn't know that unless I have the tools to measure that appropriately, the data that I can pull from systems to really do the measurement, and the rigor to perform that measurement in dollars.
That was really well put. Thank you so much. And I think the example using numbers is incredibly helpful in everybody understanding how we're actually looking to measure risk and compliance. So there's definitely a lot more to discuss on that topic. Before we do, Prabhath, what is your top compliance trend for 2022?
Sure, Kayla. Hey, first of all, thank you so much, folks, for joining this webinar. We know you had choices. You could have been in different places, so we really appreciate that. And super excited to be here. Quick intro, this is Prabhath. I currently head the security, compliance, assurance, and trust at TripActions. I have worked in Adobe prior to this, kind of running the compliance program and co-authoring and architecting the Adobe Common Controls Framework, which is open source. And prior to that, I was with a Big Four accounting firm called PricewaterhouseCoopers doing security compliance and security consulting work. So in terms of the trend, one common theme that I'm consistently noticing that is in the mind of security leaders and also business executives that manage security leaders currently is to eliminate the friction that is caused by security and compliance practices on the business. So most of you folks have probably heard of this term called shifting security to the left of the development cycle. If you are working for hypergrowth companies or API first SaaS companies where folks are kind of doing hundreds of deployments in a month, your traditional practices are not relevant anymore. You got to make security and compliance kind of injected into the overall development fabric in a way that it is just invisible, right? So that's what I mean by shifting left compliance, where traditionally the way compliance has been run in companies is with a lot of rigor, with a lot of what you call like manual processes and documentation and all of that. So all of that is changing to things like policy as a code, controls kind of embedded into the development system, into your cloud security posture, and basically having compliance control embedded into your business fabric as in business practices as an invisible fabric where you are enabling the business to kind of disrupt at a very, very rapid pace. And at the same time, you're maintaining your security and compliance posture that you need to provide customer trust and assurance. So that's the trend that I'm referring to here.
That was incredible. I think thinking about it like the invisible fabric underneath the foundation of the business is an incredible way for businesses to use this. It's a strong mentality to manage compliance going forward. So thank you so much for sharing. We'll definitely dive a bit deeper into that. Yair, can you tell us why you think data as the foundation of compliance is going to be a big trend?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Yair, co-founder and CEO of Anecdotes. And I picked this trend because I think that we're going towards a super interesting year in which compliance is going to be based on data. Now, data allows us to tell a much better story. It's not about policies. It's not about how we tell the story. It's how we rely and how credible this story is. And I think that 2021 was a great year for kicking off so many different kind of innovations that relate to data and compliance. But right now, we're at this point that we all know data is going to help us tell a credible story of compliance and maintain trust with customers, with partners, with everyone else, and by ourselves. I think that we're going to see more and more tools. I like to phrase them as the compliance OS. Companies will bring them on board. And those kind of tools are going to help companies tell a story backed by data, not by policies or any other kind of formats.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for sharing. Now that we've had a chance to hear from all of you about your top trends for 2022, let's dive a little bit deeper. One thing that seems to be a common thread for all of your trends is that the role of compliance and compliance officers in companies is shifting from a more technical role to a more strategic role. And we see this even in many CISO job descriptions that now include business aspects as well. Prabhath, can you tell us why you think that is and how companies should be thinking of this moving forward?
Yeah, so I think what's happening in the current space is that we have a lot of these different compliance requirements that are applicable to kind of business practices, and based on the nature of your business and the industry and the verticals that you're currently doing business in. There could be different kind of compliance regimes that are very, very, very applicable into kind of to enable your business, right? So what that causes is each of these different compliance regimes have several hundreds and thousands of different requirements which actually causes a lot of friction in general with your business practices, right? And your kind of overall technology practices within the company. So one of the common trends, what I'm commonly kind of noticing here is to kind of commonalize these requirements to speak a single language of compliance within your organization, and then to have the tooling to kind of enable this common, compliance practices within the organization, and then a fabric to bring all of this together to kind of enable the business.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Prabhath. Yair, is the move from technical to strategic going to be a trend in 2022? And if so, how should companies be thinking about it in terms of planning their compliance calendar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it already began, and we're just going to see how it accelerates. The fact that companies are growing fast and expected to grow even faster, that's not new. It's here, and it's here to stay. I think when companies grow fast, they're trying to look for stakeholders to help them with this pace of fast growing. And compliance leaders, specifically the people behind the wheels of compliance, are going to shift from being reactive to requests to proactive and being strategic, so that they can help the company become better, reach new domains, and actually have a better business. That's how I think compliance leaders are going in 2022 to shift to this strategic role.
Absolutely. I think the heavy emphasis there on proactive versus reactive. Let's get ahead of it before it becomes a challenge. Great. Terry, what about you?
I think no one wakes up in the morning and says, let's implement a bunch of controls, especially at a startup or a high growth environment. So compliance, well, maybe me, maybe this panel, but we're a bunch of compliance nerds. I think most startups and high growth companies get into compliance and realize they need to implement controls because there's a business need. And I think because of that, more companies are realizing that at its core, compliance is a business enabling activity. If I want to accept credit cards, I better get PCI compliant. If I want to become a public company in the United States, I better get SOX ready. So I think businesses are starting to realize that we can't shortchange compliance, and we can't try to slap something together at the last minute, because that's only a recipe for causing more pain than we're actually solving. But if you start early, if you integrate with the stakeholders who have the data you need and the way to evaluate whether or not your controls are effective as well as efficient, then you have the opportunity to get to realize value from the practice of those controls. I love any environment in which you're asking your engineers to perform their duties, and you can take credit for those duties by pulling the data they're using, by looking at the dashboards and the instrumentation that they're using to run their day jobs, and you get sort of double credit for that from a compliance perspective as well. If you integrate that well, then you have the opportunity to help the business understand why this is important, not just to check a box on some auditor's spreadsheet.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think those were all really, really well-rounded answers, and I think that brings together a lot of the common themes quite nice. Before we move on, I want to remind our audience that you can share your questions with us in the chat, so please feel free to continue sending those our way. I know a couple of you have already sent in questions. We will be addressing those additionally at the end. Now I want to move on to another big compliance trend, creating unified controls for frameworks. We saw this trend really kick off in 2021, but it seems to be gaining even more traction as we head into 2022. Yair, can you tell us a little bit more about what this means, why it's necessary, and where you see it going?
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally, compliance was an isolated process. A company had to go after SOC 2. It is a SOC 2 project. Then you want to shift and also penetrate the European market. You need to acquire ISO 27001 for the beginning. So there's another project. What happens is that as we see organic growth of the company, they know, and we try to scale the compliance program that we have. And I think that we're changing the way of doing this, instead of having multiple isolated projects, into a much better way to manage and organize it. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have different audits. We are going to keep doing this. But I think the benefit of having a single pane of glass for the controls, for the monitoring of what we do, this is the essence of the compliance. This is the essence of keeping us with the right controls in place, so that even though a company can have 3, 5, we see some companies that have 15 different frameworks, it's fine. But on a day-to-day, you want to have this unified framework that allows you to say, that's what I do, this is how I do, and I'm monitoring this continuously.
Yep. And keeping it all in one centralized location. So it's easier, not harder, to manage so many different moving pieces. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Terry, do you agree? And what should companies do to be sure they're keeping up with this?
I remember a time where I joined a big tech company, and I went around to meet some of the key engineering stakeholders. And I was talking with one of the VPs of engineering, and he took me to where some of the engineers were sitting. And I said to one of them, hey, I just happened to glance at some of the deficiencies we have, and I wonder if you can show me some evidence for XYZ control. And even though it was my first day, he said, again, you folks just asked me for this. And I thought, well, it wasn't me. And I know it wasn't my team, because I know they hadn't done that. And I realized right then how much pain the stakeholders, the actual control operators and performers bear the load of having an endless series of compliance projects, an endless series of audits running. It might seem cleaner, I guess, from a compliance perspective, to have sort of an arc of, we started our SOC 2, as Yair mentioned, we started our SOC 2, we ran the project, and it's done, and we got our certification. But from the stakeholders' perspective, you're really letting all that work roll downhill onto the people who are just trying to keep the site up. They're just trying to keep the CD pipeline live, and they really don't need one more disruptive activity taking them away from their day jobs. So yes, I'm a firm believer in finding a way, as someone who's worked at those companies that have 15 plus frameworks they need to comply with globally, it can be a real challenge to find the right way to set the bar for that. What is that unified control you're testing? It's not an easy task. And certainly the sooner you start, it is easier, because there's less cruft to tear away, and there's less complications to unwind. So I think that the earlier you start, the better. Once you have controls in place for all those various regimes, and everyone's used to the calendar, et cetera, I think it becomes, the eventual goal is still good, but it becomes much more disruptive to rework that and to set the bar and find a place where you're going to meet all your requirements. Do I go for the highest bar because I know that will satisfy every requirement? Well, if I have a requirement that only needs to be tested once a year, do I want to go bug those people on a monthly basis because that meets the highest bar? So I think there's a balance you need to find. And I think that the sooner you can bake that in and have it sort of grow organically with the company, you're better off.
That's great. Prabhath, how do you think companies should be thinking of unified control frameworks?
Yeah, so this topic is very near and dear to me, and I've implemented this in several organizations in the past, right? In my opinion, I think if you plan, there are two aspects to this, right? The first one, in my opinion, is like building your overall security program, using this as the foundation to build your overall security program in your company, okay? And I'll elaborate a little more on that. And the second aspect of this is you're building a customer trust program, right? This is your external security communications with your prospects and customers and all of that, and communicating a story of security and compliance with your external facing, entities, right? So in my past experiences, what I've noticed is, like, from physical layer and up in the stack, right? Unified controls framework, if it's implemented in the right way at all layers of your, security tooling, architecture and stack, and your development lifecycle, can be a really good tool to actually build the foundations of your security program overall, right? And then from software layer and down, you have your secure development practices and your SPLC and all of those secure coding practices and different rigors and tools and technologies that you implement to kind of round it up, right? So when you combine unified controls framework with your secure coding and secure development practices, I feel like it covers a lot of areas of your overall security program. And I've achieved a lot of success through this in the past, right? And then it also creates a very nice kind of a narrative that you can communicate externally as well as part of your customer trust and trust building activities as well, right? So basically two aspects here: improving the security posture internally and then communicating your external narrative and having a nice script to do that. So this is how I view this overall. Yeah.
Amazing. Really interesting insight there for our viewers. Thank you, to think about it as the multifaceted external and internal.
Yeah.
The next trend I want to discuss is closely related to the previous one. In fact, many of you mentioned it in your answers, but I do want to make sure we address it properly. This is automation. In 2021, we saw many early adopters opt for automation in their compliance journey for evidence collection, among many other things. Some companies with bigger teams have done this internally, while others have onboarded third-party solutions. Terry, is compliance headed down the road of greater automation, or is what we saw this year the peak?
No, I don't think we're at the peak. Certainly not. I find that there's a really good trend in the industry towards collecting data from primary sources, and by that I mean, let's please get away from taking screenshots for auditors to prove compliance with something. So I think there's a great trend to actually pull data from primary sources, because it gives you the ability to limit the amount of times you're asking an engineer basically to provide you evidence in a disruptive fashion. And that's a great start. But that's really addressing the cost to audit. And by that, I mean the disruptive cost of hiring people to run around and take screenshots, to care and feed the auditors, to pull the evidence into the right folders and all that sort of thing. And that's a great start. I think the untapped piece is really driving down the cost of compliance itself. How do I find ways native to the orchestration, the instrumentation, et cetera, that is being used in a modern, by DevOps teams, by the modern CI/CD pipeline, et cetera? How do I find ways to take credit for the work that's being done there, to take credit for the controls, frankly, that exist in those systems, and document them in a way that the business owners understand we are making choices for a reason. We're making business decisions for a reason. Do we allow code to go to production without a peer review? Well, usually not. Why have we chosen to do that? And if we take advantage of some of the automation built in those systems, to Prabhath's point earlier, we can keep shifting left where compliance actually sits, closer to the human decision point where someone is making a business decision to decide, this is a fancy word, but to decide on a policy, right? And to decide on a set of standards. So I think that's part of it. And then the other half is really taking advantage of the light speed with which we really ship code on the last mile to production. Certainly, between Jenkins and all the other tools that make the modern CI/CD pipeline a robust instrument. I'm sure anyone who's an engineer on the call is laughing at me calling Jenkins robust, but it has native hooks in it that allow you to test the temperature of how are we doing? Are we doing well or not? And if you can give that feedback loop as a risk input, then you have a way to tune what gets us compliant, what mitigates the risk at the right phase for us as a company. Certainly a large bank or financial institution is going to have a different risk appetite from a small, scrappy startup. And exploiting the automation gives you the ability to create that feedback loop.
Absolutely. Prabhath, what role do you see automation playing in compliance in 2022?
Yeah, so this again ties back to the trend that I spoke about earlier, shifting compliance to the left. I feel like automation is the future, to be very honest with the audience here. I feel the way this is going to work is if you look at your, you would typically map your compliance controls to different layers of your tooling stack. And then you would literally dissect each of those controls and map them to the tooling stack to kind of figure out how all of this can be automated, right? Like when I say automated, I'm talking about automated evidence gathering, automated testing, automated kind of dashboarding of these testing results, and even automated kind of presentation of evidence to your auditors and customers in some cases as well, right? So I just feel like automation is the future here. It's just having the right kind of mindset of designing the right level of automation to make sure that the control objectives are satisfied. So that's where the practitioner's skill sets comes into play. And that's where, kind of having working with the right tooling and the tool sets comes into play. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yair, what should companies be doing to make sure they are part of the automation trend in 2022?
Oh, it's a big question. It has so many aspects. Yeah, that's time. Yeah. I think first it's a state of mind. State of mind that automation is something that's going to help the stakeholders, the compliance leaders, everyone in the company. Second is that this state of mind should be about reaching some degree of automation. People sometimes get confused and think that, all right, the future is automation. I totally agree, but we are just a step away behind 100% automation. I think that that's something that has to be very clear, I think, to all of us, all compliance practitioners, that automation is great. It's going to help us achieve different layers, different levels of trust and credibility, but it's not going to be 100% by design, because sometimes you need someone to tell you what he did and tell you why he made this or she made this decision, which is great. Having said that, I think that there are steps that we're taking towards reaching those different automation aspects and layers. In my perspective, the trend now that I spoke about of data, if I try to formalize it, I'm usually thinking of data and compliance as a new format of artifacts. We're going to see data as artifacts for compliance. And once you have those kind of artifacts around the company, you got to get those artifacts automatically, that's the automation, and leverage those compliance artifacts in different compliance processes. So process can be towards an audit, process can be reviewing some access, process can be what Terry spoke about, managing the risk. But it has to be built on those artifacts that we can rely on, because they're continuously being ingested, collected, and analyzed so that we can then utilize. That's, I think, the first step of a company towards reaching different degrees of automation.
Very true. Thank you so much for sharing that. Before we move to some questions from our audience, there's one more topic I would like to cover, and that is how more companies are using compliance frameworks to implement security best practices. Terry, do you think this is something that we can expect to see more of next year?
I certainly hope so. I think this is a trend that, as someone who comes from both a security and an engineering background, this warms my heart, because security and compliance have both gotten over the years a bad rep for being the Department of Profit Prevention. And it's delightful to see security finally getting a seat at the table to be able to see how it can enable the business, rather than being seen as someone who is always saying no, always saying no, don't go so fast, you got to lock that down, don't keep those ports open, etc. And I think the hope is, if you're able to provide, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. I think it's twofold. First of all, if you're able to pull in data into your risk frameworks that is relevant to security, you're a step down the road towards making compliance and risk in general more relevant to security. If I am doing risk calculations based solely on interviews, and I'm not actually checking the likelihood of a threat event based on data from the actual security team who is running the SOC and the CSIRT, and they know how frequently they're getting hit, I'm missing an opportunity to build a partnership between security and compliance. And I'm missing an opportunity to turn risk into decision science that enables you to hold up a mirror and say, this is the data you've given me. This is the analysis I can do as a result. So I think if you have that sort of beneficial symbiosis between security and compliance, you of course get the compliance evidence you need, you get better risk modeling, et cetera. But I think the untapped piece that I hope we'll see more of in 2022 is the ability to turn that around and compliance becoming a business enabler for security, being able to come up with good risk scoring, being able to understand why control failures can point to security issues. I think there's a huge untapped opportunity there. And I think a lot of it starts with being able to pull data from primary source systems.
Absolutely. And I think business enablers, the theme we keep hitting on here, that's just really important in terms of shifting how we think about compliance. Yair, what are your thoughts on this piece?
I think that we see security leaders owning the compliance space and they're managing it. And it used to be this weird situation in which they just had the responsibility for compliance, but they wouldn't really care about this. It's just, you gotta pass the audit, do what you gotta do. You need some headcount, you need some headcount, you need some interviews, you're doing this. But I think that we see more and more security leaders understanding that this treasure, and I do pick this word of treasure, that they have with compliance people is actually a multiplier to what they did in the security. And maybe I'll give some examples. If I would work in a company in the security space, like as a security leader, that is shifting to more adoption of cloud and more penetration of SaaS services to different departments in a company, then I would ask myself, what do I do to ensure that what I had before in terms of security, in terms of what makes me sleep good at night, is still the same? Now, it used to be a Wild West. All right, I'm a well-reputable security guy. I know what I got to do, so I'll just start building this. I think that this is changing. And that's where it goes back to this treasure of compliance, treasure of frameworks. A specific framework is not guaranteed to anything. It's great that you got a certification of ISO 27018 if you adopted cloud, but it doesn't mean anything. But if you're taking the advantage of going through this recipe, just try to read what it tells you and then try to figure out by yourself, how would you implement the right controls based on the guidelines that plenty amount of people were thinking of? That's how security people also benefiting nowadays from different compliance frameworks. And I think that one typical example that I just see all the time is when it goes back to privacy, all right? Privacy is a big issue. It's there. It's great that it's there. It's helping us personally to feel more comfortable. Whether we're B2B companies, B2C companies, it's fine. But so many people ask themselves, compliance practitioners and security leaders, what do I do to make sure that when I say we're GDPR compliant or we're okay with CCPA, what do I really do behind the scenes? So again, it can go back to, all right, that's what I did in my previous company. Let's just do the same here and we're fine. I think that this is a classic example. We saw new ISO framework coming out recently, ISO 27701. And we now see security leaders taking this compliance framework, adopting this, and not adopting this blindly, but adopting this with deep thinking of what it means to comply with this certification. so that they can say eventually, yes, we do take care of our privacy. We used this framework's guideline to make sure that we covered what should be covered. So I think that's another example of how compliance leaders specifically becoming more proactive. And then from the other hand, security leaders working with beautiful synergy with those traditional frameworks in order to just gain more confidence in their day-to-day job.
It's very well put. I couldn't agree more. Prabhath, do you want to add to that or share your thoughts on how companies should be using compliance frameworks to implement better security?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at any of these popular, kind of compliance regimes like SOC 2, ISO, NIST, or any of that, right? You have control objectives that are pretty much hitting each area of security. And if you kind of funnel all that into like a common controls framework, you can actually kind of draft control objectives in a way that is touching each of your different security programs. When I'm saying each of your security programs, I'm talking about like product security, cloud security, incident response, SOC, enterprise security, risk and compliance, and even privacy and fraud and all of those things, right? So if you think about it, right, you can use these control objectives to actually drive security and privacy in your company, right? All you need to do is to kind of get the stakeholders aligned, get the right buy-in from all the relevant stakeholders, like your data protection officer, your engineering, your ops folks, and your finance and HR and legal folks and all of that. And then you can actually use this to drive security in a company. And this again goes back to our previous theme that we were talking about, right? If you do this right, this can be a great narrative to communicate and then can be a very, very critical business enabler. So yeah, those are my thoughts about this, yeah.
I love to hear Prabhath say control objectives. I think that's a layer of the conversation that we don't often hear unless it's often some horrible conference room in which compliance folk are talking with auditors. But I love using that term. I love elevating up out of the controls and the test steps to actually talk about the objective. Why are we doing this control? Because often when you bring that level of the conversation to engineers and other really smart people, they will surprise you by saying, the thing you're testing, I don't think it really proves what you think it does. But now that you've explained the objective, I think there's a way to actually get there. So I love to hear that.
Yeah, and Terry, I mean, that again goes back to the trend that Terry was speaking about earlier. You tie the objectives to the risk, right? When you're having these conversations and when people ask why, and us as compliance practitioners, we get this a lot, like why? But when you objectively talk about risk and the potential impact, and that's when the conversation really moves, right? That's where the needle really moves. So, yeah.
I want to add one more thing. I feel like we're in a transition point because we used to speak about compliance in a very negative way. I mean, I was part of this, all right? That was my previous experience. But speaking about control objectives, speaking about adoption of frameworks so that you get the guidelines, I think it really does changes how we think of compliance, how we think of the essence of why we're doing this. It's not for the sake of a paper. We don't care about papers. We care about sleeping good at night because we know that when we tell our customers that they can trust us, when we share with them the reason why they should trust us, we're not lying to anyone. So I think that's a very interesting language that's happening now and is shifting from the traditional thinking of compliance to, again, being proactive, being positive about this. It just felt very relevant now.
Yeah, I think especially the idea that I love the fact you keep using frameworks, Yair, because there's a world in which security often has to write policies. And no security person loves to wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to write some policies today and it's really going to change the world. It's either a checkbox, someone said, oh, you've got to write this policy or we're not going to pass our SOC 2 audit or something like that. Or, they have a strong feeling that we really should take a stand or et cetera. What I like to do, in the same way we were talking about control objectives, policies are important. And it's good to have policies because they inform you at a high level of what the intent of the leadership of the company is. And then you should be able to find a middle ground between the layer of controls and policies, which I like to call standards, actually turning those policies into applicable decisions that we make about the application of technology in a certain environment. Do we allow this environment to ship code without peer reviews? Well, we don't. So we set a standard for that. Maybe there's a more experimental MLDS friendly space where we do allow a sandbox kind of environment. We let people spin up their own environment and do whatever they want. So we have a different set of standards for that environment. And I think the more you drill into that, you give security a chance to say, yes, there's a likelihood that we're going to increase our code scanning coverage. We're actually going to get better security scanning via DAST or SAST of the code repos that we care about most. And I don't have to have a blanket policy over every single repo, but there's some areas that I really care about.
Absolutely.
Referring to this, maybe another comment I think that's interesting here is sometimes it's scary to hear about frameworks and adoption of and scaling of other frameworks. And then Terry comes with standards, which is another layer. And I think practically, this is not a benefit that's saved only for the hyper growth companies that passed the inflation point of we're big enough to do it. I think that this is, again, going back to the trends. Once we've got the right artifacts that we can generate from just different places that we already do in hopefully the best way we can do in R&D, in support, in every kind of business aspect of the company, we're now going to have artifacts to utilize and therefore achieve those standards and eventually get mature to define it the way we want it. But we don't need to wait and say, all right, we're not big enough for this. At the beginning, companies can do it. So that's, I think, a very interesting phase to see that you don't need to be a giant to build it by yourself. You don't need to be a giant to recruit dozens of security engineers, security folks, and compliance to orchestrate this. I think that's another layer of technology just helping us get better generally.
Mm-hmm. That's perfect. I think that's a really great way to think about it. I think the three of you could probably continue this conversation for a very long time. So I'm going to jump into a couple of questions because our audience members have been sending some in. Thank you for everyone who has sent in some questions. And before we start, I just want to say that if we don't get to your question today, we will make sure that one of our incredible panelists here gets back to you. So the first one that came in is the overhead required to access, gather, process, and extract insights from a functioning quantified risk management program worth it? Terry, I think this relates to your trend. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, happy to. It's a good question. And honestly, I think I got a reputation as an iconoclast in some risk circles by asking questions like, this tool is nice, but it seems like it's only for big companies. How do small startups actually take advantage of risk quantification? And I'm no longer invited to some of those meetings, but I think the challenge is there, right? The challenge is real. How do I actually find the people who can do risk quantification? How do I pull the data together? What tools do I need at scale to perform the risk analyses, et cetera? So I think it's a very relevant question. The nice thing is it's not a zero-sum game, right? You don't have to have every scenario defined to start with risk quantification. Pick one. If you're accepting PHI or PII, pick the risk of a breach from external threat actors. Pick one area, define your risk statement very clearly, define the boundaries of what that scenario is, and just find a way to make it more and more concrete, more and more discrete. And then you have the opportunity to pull the data you need. Are you worried about internal actors? Are you worried about perimeter defense, et cetera? By defining that scenario more crisply, you get the opportunity to drill in deeply. And frankly, I am much more a fan of cherry picking something that I think will be interesting to the business and drilling into it than saying, okay, we're going to spend the next 9 months building a risk quantification program. I think in most hypergrowth companies, who has 9 months to do anything, let alone work on something fancy and kind of esoteric like risk quantification. But if I can come back and say, hey, I did the math in dollars of what our exposure is to a breach and how much it would cost us to be sued by the Office of Civil Rights if we expose this PHI, then people start listening. So I think it's a very valid question. And to the tooling piece, ultimately the tools there for risk quantification make it sound a little fancier than it is. It's basically running Monte Carlo simulations, and anyone can do that with Excel or a spreadsheet or some dice and a piece of paper. So don't be put off by the artificial barrier to entry to risk quantification. I worked with some brilliant people who focus in this space, and they helped open my eyes to the fact that it seems fancier and more esoteric than it really is. Just get started.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah,
That's great advice.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I have my own opinions about this, right? So I've kind of done consulting for like Fortune 100 companies when I was with PwC. Then I actually worked for a giant software company and now in a hypergrowth startup, right? I've always, and I've crafted my own opinion on this topic based on some of these experiences. And this is a fantastic question and something that I think about all the time. I really feel that you got to calibrate your risk to your business. It depends on where your business is. How many customers do you have? How many transactions are you processing? What is the kind of business you're in, B2B, B2C? What kind of data you're collecting? A lot of other factors. Right? I'm just giving some examples. And then I would calibrate my risk to business and look at the scale of my operations and what my customers are expecting. And then kind of have some of these parameters in mind and then make a decision, right? That do I need to do like a very pragmatic approach? Do I need to have a very pragmatic approach to kind of risk assessments where it's a small enough environment? I can identify where the risks are. I speak to the key leaders, some people I can do. Whereas if the environment is kind of getting bigger, then it gets to a point where you need to kind of quantify the data, have tooling, and then derive, the right risk assessment results to communicate to your board and your executives. So I think there is no right answer to this, in my opinion. It depends on the context and it depends on how your business operations are at a particular point. And to summarize, you got to calibrate the risk to your business here. Yeah.
Great. All right. So our next question is, do you see continuous compliance becoming a trend next year? Prabhath, would you like to kick us here as well? Perfect.
Absolutely. I think this is so very well aligned with all the things that we spoke about. This is a perfect kind of question to summarize a response for. So when I spoke about shifting compliance to the left, Terry spoke about policies. So basically, when you shift compliance to the left of your development lifecycle or overall your practices, right? And then when you implement policies as a code and then have controls implemented through policies as a code in an automated fashion and kind of get real-time insights on if your control objectives are working or not, right? That's when you move towards continuous compliance, right? So I feel like there is a huge wave that is already kind of started to kind of ride right now, where a lot of hypergrowth companies are thinking about this, and the word kind of sounds fancy, but to actually implement this in reality involves a lot of planning and a lot of thought leadership around the company and have the right stakeholders, right? Because a success criteria for a control might be a certain way that an engineering leader thinks versus a compliance leader versus an auditor, right? So you got to align here, right? You got to have all these stakeholders aligned together and then define what does continuous compliance look like for each of your control objectives and then implement that, right? But to kind of answer your question, absolutely. I think it's already a trend. It's happening, and this is what the future is. In my opinion, this is where our profession is going, and it's just a matter of time. I think the early adopters are going to win. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Would you like to speak to this one too?
Yeah, I want to add one small thing. And I think that we've been hearing about continuous compliance for a while, and I'm trying to be polite here, and it didn't really work. Why did it work? Because we're trying to find an academic approach to continuous compliance, and then try to think that this is the way we can change audits, we can change sampling, we can change all different aspects of traditional compliance. What I see is that continuous compliance is becoming reality because companies deciding that they want to have continuous compliance, just the way they want to have continuous security measurements and monitoring. They feel like the risk of having gaps in your compliance is so high, it can affect the reputation. It can, God forbid, do so much, such a big disaster to the company that it doesn't worth it. So we see more and more actually companies willing to create this kind of wave towards continuous compliance because they want to be fully reliable on what they say and how they say it. Eventually, it propagates outside to the auditing world, to how we define stuff that relate to compliance. But I think the baseline for continuous compliance is actually companies that saying, I just want to know a day after day that when I define those control objectives and I said that they're in place, they are in place. And that's a very big way of shifting an ecosystem, not from the outside, but from the actual practitioner has to stand behind what they're saying.
I love that. I love that you talk about the why. We hear the buzzword of continuous compliance for many years now. And sometimes I ask people like, so why? Why do we need continuous compliance? And I don't often hear a good answer, but you summed it up perfectly. If I were to unmute anyone who's listening to this webinar who works for me today or has ever worked for me, I would say, what is my mantra for compliance? And they would say, no surprises. We don't walk into an audit and have the auditors say, aha, we found something. But how do you do that? You can't just hire millions of people and have them audit every system every day. You build continuous compliance so you get early warning when something's going off the rails.
Perfect. I couldn't agree more. And I think we could continue this discussion for quite a long time, especially with the three amazing panelists we have here. Unfortunately, there are still a few more questions, but we are out of time for today's conversation. I want to genuinely thank Terry, Prabhath, and Yair for joining us and for your great insights. I know that we leave here with a much better understanding of what to expect in compliance in 2022, and I'm sure our entire audience feels the same way. Just a quick reminder, our top trend picks for 2022 were integrated risk management, shift left compliance, and data as the foundation of compliance. We also discussed automation, unified controlled frameworks, and many more topics. I think what was especially helpful was the advice you all shared about what compliance leaders should be doing to keep up with these trends. So thank you so much for that. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today and for your great questions. If you do have any more, please feel free to reach out to us and we will make sure to get you an answer. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, a happy holiday season, and a happy new year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.